Linnell Briggs, let me put to you a question that I think has already been raised. I think it was raised by George Brandis, in fact. How would you like to see the public interest test defined? Because that's really at the heart of this legislation.
This is one of the great questions of government, I think. We see it come up in most contexts to do with public servants' work. But I would have to say, as I've said to my minister from time to time, the thing that tends to unite public servants is their view about working in the public's interest. So it's something that you learn and I think grow to understand as you become officials. But in this case, it would be guided by the pro-disclosure nature of the legislation. So the bias would be to put information out in the same way that the bias in the Social Security Act is, when in doubt, act in the best interests of the Social Security recipient. The same thing follows.
I presume you've looked at the exclusions.
No, I haven't seen the draft of the legislation. So. Oh, really? No. This is
okay. Well, let's go to someone who knows what the exclusions are more or less. That's Mark Dreyfus. What will define under those exclusions what the public interest is?
Well, for the first time, there's going to be a single public interest test, and I think that's quite important. The way the federal FOI works at the moment, I think there's 3 or 4 different definitions of public interest depending on which part of the Act you're looking at. And the key to it, as I said before, is that there's going to be a weighting in favour of disclosure, so that where there's conditional exemption, that means you've established one or other of the listed exemptions, which are going to be reduced in number, then access is to be granted. If I can just get it exactly, you must give access to the document unless access to the document at that time would on balance be contrary to the public interest. And the legislation then goes on to do something which it hasn't done before, which is to eliminate from consideration of what the public interest might mean a whole lot of arguments that are very familiar to me, because I argued dozens of these cases, and I thought they were pretty tired old arguments that government used to trot out. One of them was that access to the document might cause embarrassment to the Commonwealth Government or cause a loss of confidence in the government. Another was that access to the document might result in the applicant misinterpreting or misunderstanding the document, and another was that access to the document might result in confusion or unnecessary debate. Now, I always thought all of those were bordering on arrogant and didn't have any real part in the calculation of the public interest, and all of them are now to be eliminated from the calculation of the public interest. And on the flip side, the Act is going to say that it is to be taken into account in considering the public interest, what the objects are of the Act and promoting that, the fact that informed debate is worthwhile, and promotion of effective oversight of public expenditure. So for the first time there'll be a shaping of how the public interest is to be considered, and I think that's pretty important.
George Brandis, you've been looking at this. You said you've been looking at the specifics in the Act.
I have been looking at this, and not in the pamphlet, but in the words of the exposure draft themselves. Now, I said it in my opening remarks that, don't listen to what Senator Faulkner says so much. Look at the words of the statute itself. Let's go back to those criteria that Mark Dreyfus identified. These are the criteria which are going to determine whether or not there should be disclosure in the public interest. It's in proposed section 11B. A, promotes the objects of the Act. What does that mean? I mean, the promotion of the objects of an Act is an utter commonplace. Any statute is interpreted by either a court or a decision maker who operates it so as to operate consistently with the objects of the Act. That's why we have an objects clause in Acts of Parliament. So that takes you precisely nowhere. The second of the 4 criteria to determine whether something is in the public interest is to inform debate on a matter of public importance. So what does that tell you? Well, it's in the public interest if it's a matter of public importance. It really restates the proposition. If ever there was a bootstraps, or somebody said before, an umbilical cord argument, it's that. The third might have a little bit more substance, promote effective oversight of public expenditure. That might have a little more substance. And then the fourth, allow a person to access his or her own personal information. Well, that principle is already enshrined in the existing scheme. So, these grand criteria, or these grand categories which are said to championing a pro-disclosure culture, in fact amount to very little but verbal persiflage. And that's why, as I keep saying, Paul Kelly was absolutely right. The test of whether there's a pro-disclosure culture is the way ministers conduct themselves, and in particular, the way ministers conduct themselves in the eyes of the Parliament and in the eyes of the media.